Hey, hello everyone. I am really excited to be here. I hope you can see my screen. I hope you can see me. We'll be chatting today about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm going to say this is going to be the most high-level, basic opening session around this. So it's not a deep dive, but it is very specific to sport. A little bit about me before we go. And I also say the way the system is working, there is about a 10-second delay between what I am saying and what you folks are hearing. So know that if there is a pause at some point, that is part of it. A little bit about me. So my name is McPhie. I'm a member of Pikwakanagan First Nation and mixed settler descent. And I am a lot of random diversities as it goes. So I am 2S, so a two-spirit, which in my teachings means that I diverge from the normal of sexuality and gender. I'm also neurodivergent. What that means is my brain works a little differently than most people. So I have ADHD, so it's a bit of a weird place up there sometimes. And I'm a trauma survivor, an acute childhood trauma survivor. So I bring a lot of that to my teachings and how I'm going to talk today about diversity, equity, inclusion. And while I am no longer a swim coach, I was a swim coach for 15 years. I'm very proud of the community, very proud of being part of that community for most of my life. Now I work with a lot of different organizations around diversity, equity, inclusion, around Indigenous issues and queer issues. And I was just really excited to be invited in to help with this conversation in this community specifically. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge the territory that I'm on. This is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. Specifically the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi nations, who are collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. So miigwech, nawe for letting me be on your land and being for the stewards of this land. And I want to draw your attention to the image here that I have. So this is Timber Wolf. And in my teachings, there are 7 wise teachings, and one of them is humility. And I like to start with the teaching of humility because learning this sort of content is hard. It's not easy. And I like to think of it as, you just came off your summer break, you haven't been in the pool for a couple months, and you get in the water and it feels gross. It's gross, it feels awkward, it's weird. That is what learning around diversity, equity, inclusion is like. And you get better at it as you practice it. And so if it feels a little awkward, and we'll talk about that again in a second, know that just give yourself a little bit of an okay for it to feel awkward. Embrace those feelings a little bit, and know that not everything I say is going to sit well with you. That doesn't mean that it just means that you have to reflect on it, to connect with it in a different way. So before we start, deep dive into content, I want you to get a piece of paper from me and a pen. I'll give you a moment to get a piece of paper and a pen. I'm going to take a sip of coffee while we wait. Okay, so in the center of your piece of paper, I want you to write down what I would see if I met you. So if I was walking up to you on the street, what would I see? And if you met me on the street, you would notice that I present as female. You would notice I present as white. I'm medium tall, brown hair, I wear glasses. So what would I see if I met you on the street? Okay, so in that top section, just above where you just wrote, I want you to write down things that are important to your culture. And so In Indigenous culture, feasting is really important, so meals with families. In queer culture, rainbows are really important, and your chosen family, and dancing is important to both those cultures. There's various types of cultures that have different things that are important to them. Maybe in your family culture, phone calls to your mom once a week is important. So things about your culture that are important to you. And then what I want you to do is to fold that section over. So you're going to fold it down and behind the center. And we're going to shift over to the other side, or to one of the sides. And I want you to write down on one of the sides responsibilities you have. So maybe you're a parent, so maybe you have some responsibilities to your child. You work, you have responsibilities to work. I'm my family breadwinner, so I have a responsibility to keep a roof over our head, food on the table. The pandemic has done some weird things, and it definitely has made me feel like I have a very big responsibility of making sure my parents' health is good. Responsibilities you have in your life. Okay, I'm going to ask you to fold that piece behind the center. Now, down along the bottom, I want you to write down daily worries that you have, things that you worry about on a daily basis. And so those can be very connected to our responsibilities. So I'm worried I'm going to be late for work. I am worried that I don't get to my kids on time. I'm a woman who has experienced violence. I'm worried when I go out at night. I worry about my community accepting me because I also sit on the fringes of communities. What worries do you have that you can put in that box? And then I'm going to ask you to fold that box behind the center. And finally, you should have one tab left there. I want you to write down frustrations you get every day. It's different than worries, frustrations. Frustrations are things like my kitchen is not made for a person my height. I can't get to the top shelf. I run into issues with people not seeing me for who I am all the time. Language that people use around me. Any frustrations that you have that you run into on a frequent basis. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you to fold that piece behind. And what you should have now is a box, just a simple paper box. And if I were to meet you on the street, the reality is that all I would see is that front box that is showing right now. I have no idea what those flaps are folded behind. But every person I meet in my life has those flaps folded behind. And the experiences they've had in the world are informed by each of those flaps. And what we want as coaches, as friends, as peers, is to be able to make a space where people can unfold their kind of identity box that they've made there and show us the bits and pieces of it. Unfortunately, the reality is that we often are hiding bits. and we're hiding things from folks. So when I was a swim coach, I was not verbally out. I was not queer in the swim world. And so that was a piece that I kept folded behind and hidden. Right? So I know that if I was sitting in a room with you all, that I would not know every bit and piece of you by just looking at you. But that you all would be different. Not a single one of you has an identity box that looks exactly the same. No one wrote down the exact same things on all 5 pieces. And so I want you to hold that as a piece of how we approach things, that when we speak about diversity, that it's not always the big ones, but also little bits. We're all different, and we all need to be approached and recognized for our differences and celebrated for them. So I want to start with a definition of ally. And you'll find in the world of activism right now, there's a push towards the phrase standing in solidarity instead of allyship. But I do want to define this word. So an ally is someone who is active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating in which a person in a position of privilege and power seeks to operate in solidarity with a marginalized group. So breaking that down, basically allyship is active. You have to be doing something to be an ally. You're using your position, which puts you at risk for a group. And very important is allyship is not usually comfortable. And we can't claim to be an ally. We have to be given that. So you can't say, hey, I'm an ally for this community. If the community tells you you're not an ally for that community, you're not. This is not something that you take for yourself. It's something given. It's a gift. Okay, so that is allyship. And allyship is hard. It's a work in progress. You've never achieved it perfectly, and you've never reached the finish line. You don't get a gold medal, and you don't get a ribbon for it. Along with that, allyship in DEI spaces, again, it's very difficult. It's not easy. DEI work is uncomfortable because it challenges the privileges that we have benefited from our whole life. So you have to recognize the systems that you've benefited from in order to work in DEI spaces. DEI is really founded in the idea that our world is unfair, and that because of that unfairness, different people need to be treated differently. And equality, and I often get asked about equality. Equality is treating everyone exactly the same. And unfortunately, we're just not there. Like, our world is not at equality. It's a really nice ideal, but it can also be very harmful to different communities. So when you treat everyone exactly the same, sometimes you hurt people, and that's important to know. Okay, let's get into defining stuff. Okay, diversity. So I've used, and I will continue to use throughout this session, shapes as a reference. And in my analogy, in North America, yellow triangles will be straight, white, and male. In North America, that is the default, and it is the structures in which things are built around. It's the people who have held power and have built our societies. So that's why that yellow triangle is straight, white, and male. So diversity means that you have a variety of folks of different ages, ability, neurodivergence, gender, sexuality, skin color, religion, family status, income, and ethnic background. It does not mean that in any group of people, you're going to have all of those things, but that you're looking for folks who do have different experiences. Now, when you welcome one of difference into your group, the problem with that is that can be tokenistic and put a lot of burden on that person. I frequently get this experience where people ask me, like, what do Indigenous people think of this? And that puts the burden of voice on me speaking on behalf of an entire group of people. And that can be hard on that person. So what we're really looking for in diversity is a bunch of different types of people, different shapes, different sizes, different of the things. And I often think of this in terms of shapes or like balls or something like that, where you have just a bunch of difference. That is diversity. So when you look around the room, people look different, they sound different, they have different life experiences. Now, something I said there was important, looks different. So there are two different types of diversity. There is visual diversity and non-visual diversity. So visual diversity is someone actively looks different. And it's really important. It has been proven over and over again in studies that having folks that look like you in spaces is inspiring. It is also important to have folks who are non-visually diverse, but are diverse for various reasons. I don't exactly exude my queer looks and culture, other than my rainbow glasses. But that doesn't prevent me from being queer. Some things are invisible. So knowing that they kind of both sit in the realm as well. Okay, inclusion. So inclusion is when these folks, people who are diverse, are seen for their differences and valued, accommodated, and respected for them. So I'm going to name something. It's an elephant in the room. There's this phrase, I don't see color. I'm colorblind. So what that does, it's not good. Don't do it. What that does is that it doesn't accept and understand that people have different life experiences because of the color of their skin. And so when you don't see color, what you do is you erase their culture. You erase their experience. You erase the difficulties and barriers they've experienced in their life. So inclusion is when we actually recognize those differences and we value them, we celebrate them, and we recognize that they bring something different to the room, to the conversation. My second screen's over here, so if you see me looking this way, it's because I'm reading. So the results of inclusion is that folks of diversity want to stay in spaces and feel supported in them. So that's two big things there is they stay and they feel supported. So just because a person stays doesn't mean they feel supported. Sometimes they're just more resilient and they're willing to stay around. Okay, and just because someone feels supported doesn't mean they're stay. There might be other things in their life. Not all spaces are inclusive on purpose. This is really important. So women's only gyms, for instance, those are deliberately excluding people. And the reason for those spaces is that people need to put on masks. They put on and off masks all their life. But there's constantly a need for folks who have experienced marginalization to perform the good Indigenous person, the smart Black person, the nice queer next door, those are performances that we have to put on and off, and they're very tiring. So no matter how good of an ally you are, just know that unfortunately, you'll never fully understand the life experience of a person of diversity unless you're part of that group. And so what a space that is dedicated to us does is allow us to not perform for a moment, allow us to relax and to not have to be acting along the way. This is going to be one of the terms I define that people will disagree with me on, but I'm going to hopefully contextualize it. Discrimination. So discrimination, by definition, requires the discriminator to have systemic and historical power over the person being discriminated. This does not mean that when a person treats, if we go to yellow triangles, our yellow triangle badly, that they're not being harassed or abused or someone's being mean to them. It's just that it's not discrimination. And that's because discrimination really requires there to be historic power that you're using, historic power that you're engaging with in order to hurt another person. Okay, so equity. Okay, equity is a process. It's actions, and it recognizes that you can't treat each group the same because they experience different barriers that impact every aspect of their life. So that's education, view of self, worldview, employment, etc. And what I'll say here is that it's really, really important to note that I am not saying in this analogy that yellow triangles haven't experienced hardship. They may have. In a world, straight and white and male people experience hardship, but they haven't experienced hardship because of systems of sexism and racism. And as we look at these shapes, each one may have experienced hardship. But, so in blue triangles experience there, they have experienced hardship because they're blue, but not because they're triangles. Okay? Yellow hexagons have experienced hardship, but they haven't necessarily experienced hardship because of their yellowness, but they have definitely experienced hardship because of their hexagonness. So in this, I'm not trying to erase people's experiences of hardship. What is really important to note is just some people experience hardship that is because of historical and systemic structures, racism, sexism, homophobia, the isms. And we need to recognize that impacts everything, absolutely everything. That impacts, if you think about a teenager, that impacts if they're able to take that free internship at the really fancy place, or if they have to work at Tim Hortons to help pay for things with their family, right? So meritocracy is a word that says we each should just be treated on our merit. And the classic, I'm going to hire the most experienced person. When you do that, you will find that you are consistently hiring one type of person, because if we do not give supports to folks who have experienced more barriers to reach the same level, then they will continue to not access different spaces. So this is the way I like to think about it. Equity is the path. So Equity is the way in which you target barriers to inclusion. So it can be applied to anything, processes, policies, actions, interactions, programs. You should include the community in meaningful consultation of what they need. It recognizes and accommodates for differences. And just note that it can be emotional labor. It can be hard on folks who have experienced barriers. But equity is the path. It is what you folks are going to want to do when you look at your swim club. You're going to want to look at equitable changes in order to create difference. And the result of equity is diversity, equality, and inclusion. So they're still all action words, but this is the easiest way I think of it, is of dividing these up and understanding what the difference between them is. If you do equity programming, you will hopefully get to diversity, and they will hopefully feel included. And you'll hopefully also see the inclusion of the culture, their worldview in your club itself. So I'm gonna throw today just a whole bunch of terms. Again, I mentioned this is a very high level session. So intersectionality. Intersectionality is an understanding that people's lives are shaped by multiple and overlapping identities and social locations, which together produce a unique and distinct experience for that individual or group. For example, creating additional barriers or opportunities. So in this analogy of shapes, yellow and triangle is our default. Blue and triangle, they have a different world experience because they're blue, but they have a similar world experience because they're triangles. And they have similar world experiences to other blue shapes, but different because they're triangles. For me, you're unlikely to find another queer Indigenous woman who has experienced childhood trauma and is neurodivergent in exactly the same way as me. So that means the way I walk through the world is different. Where I understand the world is different than anyone else will necessarily understand it. And some of you may be sitting on this call being like, I identify with Laura in this way or this way. And so we might have similar experiences we can relate to, but intersectionality just recognizes that there are additional barriers for groups. And so what we know in research right now is that Black trans women and Indigenous women face the most violence in our society. It's just a thing. They face more violence than anyone else. And it's because of the way their identities intersect with each other. So simply trans women experience less violence than Black trans women. Trans men experience less violence than trans women, so on. So it's just that there's different experiences, and they experience different things because of it. And there's certain identities that will experience more violence or more aggression towards them simply because of who they are. They could just be standing still in the world, and the world will potentially treat them poorly, or more likely treat them poorly. Privilege, okay. This one people get real worked up about. Okay, so recognizing your privilege. And people get very worked up about this because it means looking at yourself, and it means being uncomfortable with yourself. So we all experience barriers, but those barriers might not be systemic or because of social or physical location. That doesn't trivialize hardships, but just recognizes that they are less common and not because of your identity demographics. So again, basically this is just recognizing who you are. So I am a white passing Indigenous woman. because of my white passingness, when I walk out my door, I do not experience racism because of my skin color. It's just a reality for me. It doesn't mean I haven't experienced hardship. I have. But I haven't experienced that hardship because of my skin color. I have experienced hardship because of my gender. And I have experienced violence because of my gender. And that's a reality in my life. And there's some people who haven't experienced violence, sexual violence, because you're not a woman the same way I am. And so that's just a privilege. It's not a bad thing to recognize our privilege. It's very necessary. And it also, when recognizing privilege, recognizing that our world, like our entire world, the laws, the way our government is set up, the way our social programs are set up, are designed not for you. So certain people, things are designed for. So in this analogy, yellow triangles, the world is set up for yellow and triangle. So the designers behind the rules, the policies, programs, and physical design, all were yellow triangles. And so they just made things for themselves. I would do the same thing. If I was designing something, I would design something for me to make me successful. The problem, though, is that when other people engage with those rules, policies, spaces, that it wasn't designed for them. And so it doesn't feel quite right. And it can sometimes be very dangerous. And when you get farther away from yellow triangle, at the end there, nothing is designed with these folks in mind. Absolutely nothing. All of their experiences are impacted by this. And this can be dangerous and very uncomfortable. So it's just really important to note there are people in our world that nothing is designed for them to engage with it in a healthy way. And to make this really simple and kind of like the analogy I like to use is my mother is short. Most architects and house designers are currently male. And so her kitchen was designed by a dude. My mother is short, so she can't reach half her stuff in her kitchen. She has to get assistance. She needs to use things that assist her to get to top shelves. Now, if that was actually designed for her, it would have been a different situation, right? Everything would have been a little shorter. It would have been potentially wider in certain places. Thinking about the places that are not designed for us. And so in the example of like a Black trans woman, we don't design spaces with them in mind or rules with them in mind, policies with them in mind. And so because of that, they're walking through the world constantly being bombarded with how they have to adapt, they have to change, they have to do extra work. And that is tiring. It's exhausting, right? So it is emotional labor and it is hard. So I'm going to do a little pivot here and talk about what to consider when considering diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because the reality is those words were all big and you're like, what the heck can I do? What can I do? And I will say this session is kind of an introductory session. The next session at 1, the para-reach session, we're going to dive into a little bit more practical around this and how to be more practical. But this is where we are currently. So when considering diversity, equity, and inclusion, you want to consider 3 distinct areas of sport and your club or whatever in which you have control of. So that's first the path to sport, the path to coaching, the path to being on your board. The next is entry to space. And the finally is the experience in the space. So we're going to go through each one of these. What I would encourage you to do is to take out paper or pen in your notebook. Just be thinking as I speak about, oh, maybe this would be an easy change we could do. Oh, maybe this is something in that area. Okay, so path to sport. So the path, by the way, a lot of this piece comes from research around gender equity programming around the world. And they've done a lot of research into the ways in which to engage women and different intersections of womenness into sport. And these are the 3 areas that they highlight as the most important. So path is both the metaphorical path and the actual path. And what you want to consider with any type of person is what barriers exist in the path to your sport or to your space. So I broke it down here between mental, physical, financial, and time. I'm going to go through each one. So the mental part of path is, do I belong there? How will I be treated? What do I get out of it? So if you, before you even go to a place, or asking these questions, just like think about it yourself for a second. Would you actually go to the place? Right? So our thoughts connect directly with our actions and our feelings. So we have to consider what a group of people is thinking before, or we just might not get them into the space. So physical, how do I get there? Am I safe on my way to and from? There was an interesting study done around a soccer program, I believe in Ecuador. And they had this very thriving soccer program. Kids were coming, it was great, free to access, lovely, all these things. And then they had to move the field they were using to 1 block over, basically, and the kids stopped coming. And the coaches were like, what happened? Why aren't kids coming now? Like, we had such a great program. And it was that block over, basically, was a little less safe for the kids to be at after dusk. So the kids stopped coming. So is it safe? Financial, can I afford participation? Will I continue to be able to participate? Like, is it worth it to start? And I know that's an ongoing problem with swimming. I know that's a bigger one to tackle and to think through, but it's one we have to consider. And time, is this a safe time for me to be out? Can I volunteer? Like, I have 2 jobs. Am I able to volunteer? Are there expectations around religious holidays? So when we think about each one of those, any one of those could stop a person from participating in the path to sport. So when you think about doing interventions with a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, or even if you're just starting, you're making a new policy, think about this, right? So it could be something simple like volunteer hours for parents. Maybe there's a way around volunteer hours for parents, or it's based off of how much time you have. Clubs need volunteer hours, but some parents just might not be able to do it. That could prevent their child from swimming, right? I think about things like uniforms. Maybe the family can't afford 2 t-shirts. And so having to wear their t-shirt every single day of a swim meet, that thing is going to stink. And that might be a barrier it turns into a mental barrier of like, I don't want to be here. So thinking about the path. I love this piece, so path, we swim in the morning and often dark. When I was swimming, I remember one day being followed by a car. It ended up being a cop car, which was already scary. I was driving myself and they're following me. So for me, it's nighttime. I'm a survivor of sexual assault and I'm being followed by a car, and it's terrifying, right? And that was something, in order to get to swimming, that was what had to happen. And then I have to get into swimming and go into the change room. I had an interaction with the cop. I'm shaking, I'm rattled, and I'm being told I'm late, right? And that's hard because I couldn't verbalize why I was upset. I couldn't verbalize why today wasn't a good day, that I wanted to get in and swim, but I couldn't, maybe it wasn't going to be the best day for me. Transportation for a lot of communities is really important to try to tackle, thinking about setting up carpools, setting up safe ways to get to the actual activity, and taking an active role in that. I know that a lot of times parents are the ones who are setting up carpooling, but taking an active role in understanding that this might be a major barrier to participation for folks. So when you're thinking about the metaphorical path, questions you can think about are, how do they hear about the program? How do they know what their specific demographic is wanted and accepted there? Who do they see as a representative of the community? And that one might be hard because you just might not have one right now, right? So that's a piece of what you're thinking through, is how do we get folks in when we don't have diversity yet? How do you show what they will experience? And is it safe physically, mentally, and emotionally? And so that might be setting up an easy entry point. So something easy to do, something easy to try. Come watch it. Come see a program, drop-in program, something like that. Something that's a gentle entry point. And then just thinking about the physical path, we can't change it all because of pool time is pool time. But what time is programming at? Is there carpooling or public transit at that time? How far from their neighborhood is the program? What equipment is needed immediately and who can support this? If you're targeting a specific community, for instance, in Toronto, a lot of communities live in certain areas. So maybe you get pool time in that area, and that helps in a certain way. Maybe there's an equipment donation process in your club. Who and what groups do you need to connect with to make them feel safer? Okay, entry into space. It is not enough to have an open door policy. I hear this all the time. Oh, our door is open, we will accept them. That's not enough. If I have been made to feel uncomfortable in a space once, or I think I might be uncomfortable in a space, I won't go to that space. Just won't. It puts a lot of burden on the person who has experienced marginalization to say, our door is open, so why didn't you come in? And the reality is they didn't come in because they have a lifetime of really crappy experiences, taking chances and being hurt because of it. And so knowing that has happened means that we have to approach this with more empathy, with an understanding that it's our responsibility to create safe space. It's on us to create those bridges, because simply walking across that bridge, simply walking through the door is a lot of work and difficult. So how do we help? So there needs to be an invitation. And that means that it's not just one invitation, like I invited you and you're done. It's, I invited you, you didn't show up. I'm going to follow up and see if, hey, what can I do to make it seem easier? Right? How do you show that you actually care, that you've recognized them and their differences, and that you are going to what they need. That might be something like I used to sit with one of my athletes who had really, really intense anxiety. And I would show him pictures of any new pools we're going to and talk through what the pool looked like. That was something I could do so that that athlete would choose to walk through the door to a swim meet. And that takes time. And I know that we're crushed for time, but thinking through different ways that you can do it. Help through the door. The initial step can be really scary. So how do you make it easier? And that can be things that, like I mentioned, I used to show pictures to this one swimmer, and I would help them visualize the space they were going to be in so that they were willing to go to that space. That's just me helping them through the door. I would also say, I'll meet you at the front door. And when they were ready to come inside, I'd meet them at the front door and walk them in. Or someone would, maybe another athlete, a friend. How can you help a person through the door? Maybe that is buddy days at swimming, where you bring a buddy to swim. Maybe that is, I don't know, some sort of show and tell. You folks are all more creative than me, but thinking about how do we make it less scary? And ask, don't assume. So oftentimes when people are approached with communities who are diverse, they're scared of asking questions. And I get this all the time. So I'll say that I'm either two-spirit or I'm queer, and people are like, okay, and they have no idea what it means. And they get really scared around me. They don't know what to say. Just ask questions. Do it respectfully. Say, I'm not part of that community. Can you tell me what you need? Right? If you can, always include the demographic in the decision making. And that can be difficult. You don't want to tokenize people, but you do want to make sure that they feel like their voice has been heard. It's really important when there's an uneven power dynamic to ask when, where, and if they feel comfortable. So I have been coaching an ultimate Frisbee team, a women's national ultimate Frisbee team lately. And something I've integrated into my practice is simply asking if they're open to feedback today. And sometimes they say no, they've had a hard day. It's been rough. It's been not an easy day. They're already upset. And if I poke them and say, like, also your throw sucks today, they might just crumble. So I say, like, hey, are you open to feedback today? And they say yes or no. And then from that point on, I give them feedback, or I don't. And I hold it and I write it down. Offer help, but don't assume it's needed. Some people really don't need it. Like, there's some strong, resilient folks out there who just don't need your help. But they might, so try it if you want, but ask. And make programs visible, but accommodations seamless. So what I mean by this is that oftentimes folks will be like, what's a good example? Oh, there's a gender neutral washroom that people can access, but no one knows where it is. And you don't know until someone asks, is there a gender neutral washroom? You're like, oh yeah, it's over here. That shouldn't be a thing. You should inform everyone where the gender neutral washroom is when they first enter the space. Male washrooms are here, female washrooms are here, gender neutral washrooms are over here. That is seamless. Now they can choose where they go to, and it's their choice. You haven't made assumptions. So visible, like, programs need to be visible. Accommodations need to be visible. People need to know that they can access them if they're going to access them. It shouldn't be a secret taboo thing. Accommodations aren't secret and taboo. It's okay. They're okay to have. I cannot express this enough. Try to empathize with your users. So who are your users, be it parents, swimmers, board members, whoever it is? Empathize with them. What might they be thinking in any one moment? Right? I know when I just moved to Barrie, and I like playing Ultimate Frisbee. And I didn't sign up for Ultimate Frisbee when I first got here. My partner did. And when the Ultimate Frisbee people asked me why I hadn't signed up as well, and I'm a pretty bold person. I was worried about not being good enough. I was worried about them not wanting me there. I was worried about looking stupid. I was worried about so many things, and it stopped me from playing. And then I got to know people a little bit more, and then I joined. And that might be like, you could be sitting there being like, yeah, just like pull up your bootstraps, Laura, get her done next time. But the reality is that the way in which I have engaged in the world makes me very anxious about certain things, and those are barriers to my inclusion. I personally like going to women's only gyms. It's not because I haven't been raised around sports. It's not because I'm not athletic. It's not because I'm overweight. It's none of the things. It's just I like going to places where people aren't looking at me sometimes. Thinking about the different ways and different thoughts that people might have. So I mentioned there needs to be an invitation. You absolutely 100% need an invitation, and it probably needs to happen twice. I say this because people are used to being excluded. They're also used to getting insincere invitations, and oftentimes groups will wait and see if a group means it. So how do you show that a person is going to be accepted and that you're going to help design space around them, and make it frequent? And safety means a lot of things. So physical safety, emotional safety, and mental safety. The less confident a person is, the more safe you have to make them feel. And due to marginalization, people will feel unsafe in new spaces. It's just the reality. And this is something that I don't wish on anyone my feelings of unsafeness. But something I need people to understand is how unsafe I feel in spaces, frequently, all the time. And so I'm always putting on a bit of an act, a bit of a bravado, right? When I was a coach, again, I wasn't out when I was a coach. So things like people asking me if I was bringing a partner to the dinner or something like that. I didn't. I never did. Because it wasn't safe for me, and that was scary. So just remember that people who have experienced marginalization, they feel unsafe. And it doesn't necessarily mean they'll name it. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will people explore that lack of safety with you. But how do you make a person feel more confident and supported into a space? And it's physical, emotional, and mental. So in our final section here, experiencing the space. When a space is uncomfortable, people leave. I'm sure you've experienced this yourself. You leave when a space is uncomfortable. So what does equitable care look like for a person's experience in swimming? And it's really important to remember that it's equity, not equality. So that is what gets people around policies all the time and stops people from doing anything through a DEI lens. They're like, I have to treat everyone exactly the same, or it'll be seen as unequal. Sure. But if you do that, you're going to leave a lot of people out because it's not equitable. So making sure that you have the reasoning and the understanding that we are doing something unequal right now because we need it to be equitable. So does a person need additional time and support? And they might. Do they need assistance? Do they need to have access to multiple groups of people to support their physical development, the cognitive, and the social level? So that might mean that a person is in different groups, that they're not always in the same group of swim group, that they move around a little bit. That might mean that a person is with a specific coach more often. What does it look like to provide specific support for a person? And I understand that that creates a question around capacity and coaching capacity and what that looks like. But I do think that there's a way forward in which you help a person along, right? I'll tip my hat to Kendra Papel, who used to keep the boys together a lot. She's like, instead of spreading them out across groups, she would cluster them together, and she just recognized, and then they'd swim up when they needed to or swim down if they needed to. And she just recognized that, like, in swimming, we have less dudes, and maybe they want to be together and have some fun together. And it was like an interesting way to approach it, of being, instead of like each of these swimmers needs to be in this group, she's like, how do we keep them together? I appreciate that approach because that was equity. It wasn't necessarily equality. We weren't treating everyone exactly the same, but looking at them as a group of people who might need each other to support each other. Help through the door. Again, the initial step is scary. How do you make it easier? And don't assume and ask. I feel like I repeated that one. I'm sorry. Okay, so this is an example experience, and I just can't express enough how important this is. So a person joins a place, and everyone's like, yay, we've got diversity. And there's this like honeymoon period where everyone's really happy with each other, and they're like, we've got a new person. It's super exciting. And then unfortunately, the space is not designed for that person. And that's not necessarily your fault. The swim world, for instance, was not designed for me. As a queer woman, if you think about swim meets, one of the things that I had to constantly think about was how to get to a bathroom that didn't have swimmers in it. I always had to think about this. How do I get to a bathroom that does not have swimmers present, changing? Because our current structure of swimming is not designed around queerness and what that means, right? So because of that, and I'm going to define some of these words in a second, there will be microaggressions and repetitive injury. So first, a little bit, tokenization happens. I've had this happen to me all the time. He was at work one time, and this communications person came prancing over to me, and she was like, Laura, you're Indigenous. I need a symbol for indigeneity. Did not take into consideration I was doing my own work, own things. And she was just like, I need you for this. And it was one of those moments where I was like, I can't speak for symbols for all folks. Like, I'll give you some examples. And so what happens is that person experiences these hardships, but is invested in the area. So they sit down and they think about change. Like, how do we change it to make it better? And they put some energy in. They often confront people about it. Say, like, this is the change that I need to make things better. And then they get attacked. And this happens all the time. I It's happened so often, I can't even explain how often it's happened to me, where I'm often the voice that says, hey, here's a problem. And someone tells me, well, no one else has that problem. Well, yeah, because no one else has my life experience. No one else has the hard barriers that I have experienced in some ways, right? And so oftentimes what will happen is there'll be kind of a denial, not only a denial, but an attack of that person. Of putting them up against people who have, and in this example, I use disabilities, but against other people who are saying, well, Laura, you're a woman and this other woman doesn't have that problem. So that means that women don't actually have the problem. Happens way too often. And so that person will leave. Do some terms. I'm trying to make sure there's enough time for lots of questions as well. So in what I just mentioned before, microaggressions. So microaggressions is a term. Some people say that it should just be called aggressions, but I call them microaggressions still. So if you picture mosquito bites, if you got one, that's okay. So when someone's like treats you a certain way once, you can brush that off and be totally fine with it. But if you got 10 a day or more than 10 a day, and you just keep getting them day after day, that becomes a major problem. So microaggressions are little, small, indirect, subtle, and unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. So a simple one, I was at work one time and one of the managers came around and said, I need male help to carry some things. I need some guys to help carry some things. And he meant boys, like he meant males, which is like one of those moments where you're like, oh, I can't carry things. You just very like clearly had gendered who does lifting of stuff. And that might seem little, but it happens all the time. You hear things like that all the time. Little bits and pieces that just kind of pick and scratch and poke at you that become really heavy. And if you're not a person who has experienced microaggressions, it's hard to conceptualize like why you can't just brush it off. It gets very tiring through the days. It gets very tiring. I have been frequently called things like aggressive. I've been called loud. I've been called all of these terms that are very gendered. Like, I'm a leader, I'm assertive, sure. Loud, yeah, I was a swim coach. I had to project, like, what do you want from me? All these little things that just kind of weird is one I get a lot. Different is one I get a lot. Well, you're different, so you see things differently. So yeah, I do. But what do you mean by different, right? Stereotyping is a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular group of type of person or thing. The one I see in swimming a lot is this idea that like Black people are good at sprinting. So I'm not going to say that they can't be good at sprinting. Yeah, sure. But we also know that that's a very oversimplified version. If you look at running, you see people who are Black at all different distances of running, right? So this is a very oversimplified idea. But as coaches, we can push people into sport in a certain way, right? So we can be like, build a person up like sprinting, and they'll end up there. I know that like we're mind ninjas. We do that work, right? So we just have to be careful sometimes of how stereotypes are connecting, are linking us to kids in a certain way and how we're pushing those stereotypes on them. Difficult. This one is very particularly important. Catch yourself when you think a person's being difficult. Marginalized groups are frequently seen as difficult or needy because they have to advocate and ask for what they need. And that's because spaces are not designed for them. You cannot say that enough. Spaces are just not designed for them. And so they're not being difficult or needy. They're asking for what they need to be successful. And the more they have to ask, the harder it is for them. And also know that a lot of people have had some very bad experiences around asking for what they need. And so they might just not be asking you. They just may be tired as well from asking. But difficult, I get thrown difficult a lot towards me. And it's hurtful. It is hurtful to hear that we're being considered difficult because you're just saying, hey, I need something. I need something in order to be successful in this space, in order to thrive in this space, I need this. And tokenism I've touched on from the beginning. It's when there's only one type of person, and it is often them that are kind of asked to explain their life experience. It means that they are constantly feeling slightly uncomfortable, put on the spot. I was in class one time, a university class, and it was an Indigenous Canadian history class. And I'm sitting with a friend who's very visibly Indigenous. Like he was super Indigenous looking. I'm not. But we're the two Indigenous people in this class. And the teacher turns directly to him and asks a question, goes, in front of everyone, what is your experience of colonialism? And he's sitting there going like, what? So I've mentioned that it's really important to consult with groups and to talk to them, but at the same time, be gentle with how you do it in a sensitive way, in a way that's not putting them on the spot, not asking them to be the only voice of the community, but simply trying to engage with their voices. Okay, so I will say that, again, there's another session coming up that's very practical. It's going to be working through kind of what you can do, how do you plan, how do you make goals, how do you move forward? But here's what you can do right now, some steps for you to think about. So check what you know and do some reading. Okay, step one is you. Do some reading, be ready to learn, do some research online, watch some YouTube videos, and be open to changing language and actions. Oftentimes when we learn something, we often feel that it's a bit of an attack on us because we've done something bad in the past. Or not bad, we've done something in the past that someone is saying is bad. And so we often kind of buckle down because we want to protect our past selves. We want to protect who we see as our identity as being like a good person. Just kind of put that away. I know it's hard, but change the language and actions. It requires us to recognize that there's just some things that we've done bad in the past. So for instance, there's 2 times I've been like pretty hard called out in the past that I remember. So one was around my language around gender. And so I use folks now a lot. It took me forever. It was very hard to transition to. It was awkward. It felt weird. But instead of using guys, I use folks. And that was just a change of language that someone asked me to do. And I've been trying to do it since. And then another one someone called me on was, I had said something about what was the phrase? It was something along the lines of like they gypped me 50 cents or something like that, which I guess is very derogatory towards folks who are gypsies. And I didn't know that. And so they called me out on it and said, don't use that again. And so I tried to stop. Both of those, I could sit with myself and be like, ugh, they're so sensitive. They're so blah, 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 blah. I could do that, but it's not about me. It's about them. And so they were hurt by what I was saying, and they provided the way to a solution. And if I centered my pride and I centered my past self and keeping my past self safe, I wouldn't have been able to move forward in a good way with those people. So do some reading, learning, be ready to be a bit uncomfortable about it. Do a demographic scan. This is something I'm recommending right now to all organizations, is you simply do a demographic scan or a demographic survey to see who you got, what's going on, what type of people do you have. And then what you can do is you can say who is missing and why. So you don't know who's missing until you know who you've got around. And that can't just be visual. So you can't just, part of it is visual, look around, be like, who's missing? But part of it is also seeing what types of folks are in your space and then targeting who's missing. And create an anonymous feedback space. And I was thinking about this the other day, and who would read it in a swim club? Does it go to the coach? Does it go to someone else? And I'm not sure. You'd have to talk about it with your club, but I think it would need to be 2 people, a board member and a coach probably. But anonymous is really important because sometimes it's really hard to bring things forward. Sometimes it's really, really hard to ask the questions, to request the things. So being both open to feedback that is direct, good, but create some sort of anonymous space as well where people can ask leadership questions as well. So I wanted to make sure there was space for questions. So we got about 15 minutes of questions. Again, I'll say the para-reach session at 1 will be a kind of a practical application of this session of how, because sometimes diversity, equity, inclusion is like steering up that mountain. It's like, where do I even start? How do I get anywhere? And so we're going to be talking a little bit there specifically around para-inclusion, how you can start taking those first steps and what that looks like. Wonderful. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And I am open to any form of questions you have. I can see the chat as well. I can see Dean kind of typing away. Yeah, so tip of my hat to Dean, who's created a community experience advisory panel. This is a group of very diverse humans that are thinking about little steps for Swim Ontario to move forward, including things like this and having this session and talking about it. The starting point is hard. It's like a weird spot to start. And it looks like there's so much to do, but some of it is really little steps, simple things. I'll do the awkward facilitator pause for any questions.
So Laura, can I just say that I loved your first illustration of the box and how you only see one side. I thought that was amazing and really a very practical way to illustrate a really deep issue that we do have in the world today. So I really wanted to thank you for that. I thought that that was excellent. And then I wanted to ask you, if you were to walk into a situation, what would be something that would make you feel comfortable right off the bat? Like when we're talking about this, what would that look like?
I'm a huge fan of visual indicators. So things like a safe space sign with like the flag on it for the queer flag. That's like a huge one for me. Something super safe that you put on your door. I love seeing land acknowledgements in written places, like on the website, various things like that. On websites also, just feedback forms so that you can just fill out and put in. Tells me that people are at least open to feedback. Yeah, visual indicators, little visual indicators that show off like your thinking. So Orange Shirt Day, wear an orange shirt. That will tell anyone who's Indigenous nearby that you're thinking about it, at least. And I think those are usually the first steps, are small visual indicators.
Great. Thank you. I think those are little things that people can start to do almost right away. So that's really great. So I am going to thank you very much for your time, Laura. I know that you spent a lot of time preparing for this, and I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing your expertise on this area. It is definitely something that we are thinking more and more about, as mentioned with Dean and starting the panel that we were both sitting on. So yes, I want to thank you so much for your time. I also want to remind people that there is a diversity and inclusion panel happening tomorrow evening. Dean mentioned that in his comment as well. That's at 7 p.m. So that's another avenue of where we're going to have discussions around how do we be more equitable, diverse, and inclusive in our swimming community. Laura, thank you again. So we have a few more minutes, so why don't we leave it open? The chat is open if people want to ask questions. I know Laura will stick around for the next 10, 12 minutes and we'll answer any of those. But Laura, thank you so much today.
Thank you. It was great to be here and great to be chatting about something that I just hold very close to my heart.
You can tell, so thank you for sharing.
And yeah, everyone else stick around. So if you have any questions, let me know. Also, there's the private chat function. So if you want to ask a question, but you don't want to be tagged in it, feel free to send me a private chat and I will read it out and answer it. Also, I'm loving this platform. It's like fun to like the things.
Absolutely. So Laura, you mentioned the Reconciliation Day that is coming up on Thursday. And I know that wearing an orange shirt is one way to show your support and that you're thinking along those lines. Is there anything else that people can do on Thursday or any day to kind of show that this is something that they're thinking about?
Yeah, for sure. So one, do the research as well around what Orange Shirt Day is. So there's orangeshirtday.com or .org. And it will talk a little bit more about the process. So it was a day originally founded to recognize and remind people that residential schools existed, because a long time they've been very quiet about it. And then also like look into some Indigenous organizations and vendors and spend some money in the Indigenous economy. I highly recommend. If you're really interested in a group, I recommend the Assembly of Seven Generations. It's a youth group. It's youth-led, youth-founded, youth-run, and it's really a very remarkable group to donate to, and they're completely unfunded for the most part. So,
wow.
Yeah.
And what kind of projects do they do?
They do all sorts of youth programming in the Ottawa, but also the national area. So there'll be some of it is land-based, some of it's sport-based, some of it is language-based. They just are a community for Indigenous youth in urban centers. Yeah. So recommended. And yeah, Orange Shirt Day it's really interesting because some provinces have it off, some don't. And it's really a remembrance day. So take some time to learn and remember.
And the one thing I personally have found is that it seems that there's more information now readily available. I'm sure it always was there, but I feel like it's more accessible now. It's where it's kind of easier for people to find and to be informed on. So I think that that's a great step that's also happened recently.
Yeah. Yeah, you can buy orange shirts at the Native Community Centre in Toronto and Spadina, that's for sure. Do try to buy from an Indigenous vendor. I know groups like Walmart are selling orange shirts, but we're encouraging folks to try to put money into the Indigenous economy or a group that donates back into the Residential School Survivor Fund. So trying to do that.
I just received a question for you guys via private chat.
Yes.
I live in a rural community, so gender neutral bathrooms similar to female. Our community center has a family male, female, or we can designate a gender neutral bathroom with what we already have. So that is the question so far.
Okay. Yeah, so gender neutral bathrooms are a great option. I'm also starting to see signs go up in spaces that say the person who is in this bathroom is meant to be here. There's some interesting language that you can find online, basically just saying, like, if you see someone in here and you're concerned, don't worry, they're fine. They've chosen to be here and it's fine. So those are easy signs to put up in male-female spaces. And then in terms of gender neutral, I usually, like family washrooms, I would gender neutralize them and just say, like, that's a gender neutral washroom space if you can. Often there's also accessibility washrooms that are turned into gender neutral options. So the idea behind it is that they're just present before a person who is non-binary is there. And also that they encourage safe space for people who don't necessarily feel safe in normal washrooms. So someone like me, I still identify as female. I would go into a women's washroom happily. The reason why I would not go into a women's washroom when swimmers are in it is on pure fear of a parent saying, well, Laura's queer, so she must be looking at girl bodies, which I just needed to avoid at every possible chance. So if you can, just encouraging people to be like, people get to go to where they want to go. And here's the neutral space if you want. My experience with gender neutral washrooms in the swim community is that it tends to be like everyone goes to it anyways. Like you just get all the teens are like, put in here. So figuring out kind of like, that's an interesting kind of space to have to meander as well, but that would be my suggestion.
Excellent, thanks. That seems to have answered their question.
It's interesting. They just renovated an outdoor pool house here in London, Ontario, where I'm based, and they actually converted it from male and female washrooms to it's all universal now. So both sides, you go whichever way you want to go, and they have the stalls for changing if you want, or for using the washroom, and so they've just kind of made the whole place open and accessible across.
Yeah, which is amazing. So in the next session, I'm going to be talking about universal design. And that is universal design at its best because it helps folks who are non-binary, but like if you think about it, it helps parents who have like a male parent who has a daughter with them, or it helps all sorts of folks out to just make it easier to go to the to go to the washroom to change. Hi, Laura. Is there value to creating community partnerships when instituting EDI in your programming? For sure. So absolutely, if you can get the voices of communities involved. So there's the saying, nothing without us, nothing about us without us, nothing about us without us. So if you can, create community partnerships, invite people in to give talks, ask the communities what they need, which is a big one. So for instance, if you're going to be approaching, we have a low amount of BIPOC people in swimming, specifically Black people in swimming, like finding community centers to be like, what type of programming do you need for feeling safe at swimming? You're not going to get the answers of what their barriers are without asking them. Also, hi, Stu.
That's a really great question that Stu raised there. And we're actually going to be discussing that in the third REACH webinar session that is going to be on October 6th. We're going to be talking about how do you build those relationships? Where do you look for them, and what do those look like? And we have Dave Sora and Franco Taverna from the Center for Accessibility in Sport and Play that are going to present on that exact topic. So hopefully, if people are interested in how do we make those connections in the community, you can come to that session on October 6th and get some answers to your questions as well.
Wonderful. Well, folks, I am always open to questions and follow up if people have questions that pop up. I'm just going to put my email in the chat, and if you end up being like, I need to pop a question to you, feel free to reach out. And I hope you folks come to the 1 o'clock session as well, and hear a little bit more about what's going on and ways you can implement this. And I was really happy to have everyone here and to be chatting. So have a great day, and see you folks in like half an hour, hopefully.
Thank you, Laura.
Amazing.